Hi, in this tutorial I will show how you can plot data in a Windows Forms application. So basically plotting data in a Windows Forms application is typically something you want to do quite often. The sad thing is that the built-in chart control for Windows Forms is no longer supported by Microsoft in the latest .NET versions. So basically you need to find some alternative solutions to this previous chart control that was built into the Visual Studio and created by Microsoft. So this chart control in Visual Studio that was built in no longer exists in the newer versions of .NET. So basically this system.windows.forms.data visualization no longer exists. So basically we need to use a third-party chart tool. There exist many third-party chart tools. Some of them are commercial and cost money, while others are free. In this tutorial I will use a free open source plotting library for .NET called ScottPlot. So let's get started with this ScottPlot plotting library. So it's a free and open source plotting library for .NET. And basically you just start using it by installing a NuGet package directly from Visual Studio. You find more information about ScottPlot in general on their homepage. So basically this is all you need to do in order to get started with the ScottPlot. So basically you need to install the ScottPlot.winforms NuGet package and you do it directly from Visual Studio inside your solution when you create a WinForms application in Visual Studio. Next, you just drag the forms plot from the toolbox onto your form, and then you can start writing the code in order to create a plot inside your application. So in order to create a simple plot, you basically just need a few lines of code. So assume you have two arrays, one with X data, in this case just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have the Y data. Also this is an array with the doubles, and then you could have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25 or whatever, and then you just use forms plot 1, which is the default name. Of course you can change it in the properties window, dot plot, and the function or method called Add.Scatter, which is the default or basic plot in the ScottPlot library. And then the input argument is just the two arrays, data X and data Y. And then you just show the plot in or the data in your application by just using the refresh method. So now I have opened my Visual Studio, so then just create a new project. Select a Windows Forms application, click Next, and then specify a name. So I just have created a local folder here where I put my solution. So then I can just call the app whatever I like. I just can call it plotting data. I can call it plotting data like this, and then just click Next. I select the latest .NET version, which is basically 7. I just use .NET 6. Of course you can use 7 or just use the .NET version that you prefer. So I just click Create. And then the first step now is to install this NuGet package. Then I just go to my project, just right click, select Manage NuGet Packages, and then here under Browse I just search for this ScottPlot library like this, and then there are several versions here. We are going to create a Windows Forms application, so we need to select ScottPlot.winforms. click install, and then just click OK. And now the library has been installed, and as you see here in the Solution Explorer, under Dependencies, Packages, this ScottPlot has been installed. So the next step is just to drag in the control from the toolbox, and if you don't find it, you just search for ScottPlot, but I find it here, ScottPlot.WinForms, and then you have this forms plot, and just drag it to the designer, and then here I have a basic plot. Then I can resize it, or I can resize this one to fit the plot like this. So basically, now my graphical user interface is finished. I can of course change form 1 to something more meaningful, plot data or something, and then I just double click here, and then we can start creating the code in order to show data for this plot or this chart. So let's just start with our basic data set. We have two arrays, data X and data Y. So this should be the data on the X-axis, and this should be the data on the Y-axis. And then we just use this forms plot. I guess this is the default name. Of course, you should change the name to something more meaningful for you and your application. And then dot plot. And then we use this scatter plot, which is the default plot here in the ScottPlot library. So Add.Scatter. And then just the input to argument to this method is just two arrays of data, namely data X and data Y, like this. So basically this is all you need. Then also you typically want to refresh it in order to make sure that the data are presented in the chart. So then just use this refresh method, like this. So basically that's everything that you need to do. So then just run the application by clicking on the run button here. And then you see we are getting this data plotted using this ScottPlot library. And then you see the X-axis is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which you see here, 1, 2, 3, 5. And then we have the Y data, which is 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25, like this. So basically, this is how you plot basic data using this ScottPlot library. And of course, you can improve the code there. You can put this code into a separate method. So let's just create a method called create chart or something, like this, and then just put the code inside here. Then it shouldn't have any return value, so we just use void like this. And then inside this form 1 underscore load, which is the method that is executed when the application is starting, we just call this create chart method like this. So now the code is a bit more structured, but the result will be the same. You get this chart in your Windows Forms application. So we have learned how to use a basic scatter plot using this ScottPlot plotting library. So the next step would be to show or demonstrate how you can plot real-time data using this scatter plot. So we are back in Visual Studio, and here is the previous example, the basic chart example, where we use this Add.Scatter in order to plot the data in these two arrays. So the next step would be to plot so-called real-time data. Assume we have a sensor or something that we want to plot data using this ScottPlot library. So typically the first thing we need to do is to go to the designer here and then just add a timer. So now we are going to update the plot inside the timer, let's say every second or 10 seconds or whatever. And then you can in theory read data from a real sensor and then plot it here in the plot. So basically we will just use a random generator in order to simulate values from this sensor. It could be a temperature sensor or it could be other types of sensors. So then just use this timer, double click on it. Here in the toolbox, just double click on it and then it's here. And then you can double click on it in order to create an event handler for this timer. Of course you can change the name for it. Here timer 1, you can change the name here in the properties window, but the default name is just timer 1. I just use the default name, but typically you should change this name to a more descriptive name that give meaning in your application. Then inside this timer, let's start by initialize the timer in the form load. So then inside the form load we can initialize the timer. Let's start by so then just time 1 and dot, and then we typically need to specify the interval, and this interval is in seconds, in milliseconds. So then 1000 is basically 1 second. Next we need to start the timer, so then we just timer 1 dot start like this. So now the timer should be okay. So next we need to create the code. So basically let's just in the create chart method just create these two arrays. Let's put it in the top of the class here like this. And now we are not plotting these data, since we are going to plot data from this sensor, or actually in this case just a random generator. So you just create two empty arrays, one for the X data and one for the Y data. And then this create chart method we created in the previous example, you can change it to update chart or something, because now we are going to update the chart in this case every second, but we can easily change the interval of the timer here. So here let's start by creating a random generator. So then we just use the built-in one, random, and then just creating a variable called random or rand or something equals to new random like this. And then let's just create a variable called the double new value or something. And here we are going to use this random generator like this. So this generates a value between, as you see here, generates a value between 0 and 1, assuming you want to simulate a temperature value between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius or something. Then we just multiply with 10. Then we get a value between 0 and 10, but we want to have it between 20 and 30, and then we just plus 20 like this. So now we have created and used a simple random generator in order to simulate a temperature value between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. And then we have changed this method to update chart, and then just remove this one from the form load. And now we are going to call this update chart method here in the timer event handler. So then just change name to update chart like this. Next will be to fill in data in these arrays that we have created here, which is which is empty so far. So then we just start by data x equals to data x, and then we want to append a value to this array. And for the x array, it should be just a running number, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So then we just create a variable, we can call it k, k equals to 0. So basically just create an integer variable k starting by 0, and then inside this update chart we just type k plus plus, meaning it's increment the value, so it starts with 0, and then first time it's k will be 1, next time it will be 2, 3, 4, etc. So then we just inside append here we just put k, and also we need to use these two array method like this, and a semicolon. So basically this is the x data, which will now be an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then we do the same for the y data like this, and then no, we should not use k here, but this new value, which is this generated or simulated temperature value, which is between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. And also use this two array here like this. So now we have the x array and the y array, which are now put into this Add.Scatter function, x and y, like this. Basically here, since we are now plotting and updating the chart in every iteration here, we typically use the dot render instead of refresh, like this. So basically this is the first version, so let's just run the application and see what's happening. So that was the first value. The second value, basically it's a value between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius in this case. And you see we have to roll around in order to see the updated value. So then basically we just need to use one more function or method. So basically we need to use this forms plot 1 dot plot and then dot axis auto, like this. So let's just run it now, and now the axis should be automatically updated. So now you see this was first value, second value, third, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. And then you see the y-axis is between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. And then you see one more thing here. You see in each iteration the color of the plot is changing. So typically you don't want to change the color in each iteration. So let's see how we can fix that. So basically in order to set the color, we just use another argument of this Add.Scatter method. So then basically comma and then color, and then we just specify a specific color. It could be, so then we just use the built-in color class, then color dot, and then we can specify or use any of these predefined colors. So we have lots of different colors to choose between. So just use, in this case I just use orange, like this. Now let's just run it. So now You see that this AddScatter has X data, Y data, and then you can specify different properties here, and one of the properties is the color. So then just run it. And you see now it's orange, and then it's orange all the time like this. So basically this is how you create a simple chart for real-time plotting using this ScottPlot library. And in this case we are just using a random generator in order to simulate a real temperature sensor that present temperature value, in this case between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. So the next step now will be to have a title for our plot, X-axis label and a Y-axis label. So let's see how we can do that. So then I just create a new method here in my application. I can call it initialize chart or something. And inside this initialize chart method, I can specify different properties. One property could be this x-axis, or sorry, x label. And then inside here you just specify the name. On the x-axis we typically have time in seconds or something. So that's the X label. You can just copy it, do the same for the Y label, just change X to Y, and then since we are now simulating a temperature value, we can just specify here temperature. And typically we also want to have the unit in degrees Celsius, like this. So now we have X label and Y label, and then finally we could also have a title. So then let's select the title and then create a proper title. It could be temperature sensor or something. So basically now we have created the X label, Y label and title, and then in the initialize method we just call that method in the form here, form load, like this. So now let's just run it. And then you see you have a title, X label, Y label, and the data are now plotted inside here. So basically this is a basic real-time plot using this ScottPlot plotting library. So now we have learned how to plot historical data using this ScottPlot library. We also learned how to plot real-time data. The next step would be to show how we can plot data that are stored in a database. So we will use the SQL server in combination with this ScottPlot library. So here you see the example application that we're going to create. So here we have this ScottPlot with title, X label, Y label, and the data inside. And in this case, the data we see here are stored in a database, in an SQL server database. In addition, we just add a data grid view as well in the bottom here to show the data that are present in this plot. So basically we are going to create a very simple database and a very simple database table. Normally you typically have a more complex database structure, but this is just to demonstrate the principle. So I have created just a table called data. We can assume the data that should be stored in this table are coming from a temperature sensor. And then I create just three simple columns. One data ID, which is basically a primary key. In this case, I have created it to be an identity 11, meaning this value is created automatically by the database. So when you put data into this table, it will start by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then I have a timestamp and then the actual data value. For the timestamp, I just use default and the built-in getDate function in order to automatically insert the current date time for each record in the database. So now I have opened my SQL Server Management Studio, which is the tool that you are using in order to interact with your SQL Server database. So basically, here is the table script that I showed you. And basically, in order to insert that specific table into the database, you just click execute, and then this table will be created. I have already done that, and you see it here, the data table, which has been created. I have also inserted some data. In order to insert data, of course, you should log data from a real sensor, but in order to create this charting example, you can also right-click here, edit top 200 row, and then just enter data here manually. Then I can select all from data, and then you see that these data has been created inside the table. So now we know that we have some data. So the next step now is to create a Visual Studio application that are actually plotting these values. So now we are back in Visual Studio, and now I have actually created a new Windows Forms application, which is empty. So the next step now is to install the necessary NuGet packages. So let's start with the NuGet package for the plotting, the ScottPlot library. So then just search for ScottPlot, and then we use this ScottPlot.winforms, install it. Okay, so now we have installed the ScottPlot library. The next is to install the NuGet package for communicating with an SQL Server database. So the namespace for this one is called Microsoft.data.SQL client. So that's the NuGet package that you need to use in order to communicate with an SQL Server database from Microsoft. So then just select this NuGet package and click install. Click OK. And now actually we have installed 2 NuGet packages. If you go back to the Solution Explorer here in Visual Studio and dependencies and packages, you have the ScottPlot NuGet package, and you have the Microsoft.data.SQL client. So then we have all the packages we need in order to create an application that retrieve data from a database and plot it using this ScottPlot library. Then I just drag in the necessary components here from the toolbox. Start with the ScottPlot, and then also I'm using this data grid view. Just search for it, data grid view. Select this one, drag it down here. Just make it in the same size as the chart, like this. So basically this is the graphical user interface we have. We have a chart and we have a data grid view. So the next step would be to create a separate class for the data communication part. So then I just here in my project just create a new folder. So add new folder, and I create a folder for that I just call classes. So here inside this folder you can create the classes that you need in your application. Then I right click on the folder and then just create or add a class. And then since we are going to simulate that we are logging data from a temperature sensor, I just call this class sensor data.cs like this. So in order to save some time, I just copy and paste some code that I have already made. So basically now we are in the sensor data class, and then I here create 3 properties: data ID, data timestamp, and data value, which is the same names. Of course you can call it whatever you like, but that's the same names that we are using in our database. Basically the data ID column, the data timestamp, and the data value. So basically we are going to retrieve the data from the database into these 3 properties, and then we create a method called, we can call it whatever we like, but I call it get sensor data, and the return value of this method is a list of these 3 data. So the first thing we need to do is to create a connection string, which is basically the name of our data source, which is the name of our SQL server, which you find here in the top here. So that's the name of your SQL server. And then here you have the name of your database. In my case, it's called sensor system. So it's here. So that's the connection string you need in order to log on to your database from the C# code. Then we just specify the data that we want to retrieve. Basically a simple select statement: select data ID, comma, data timestamp, comma, data value from data table. So basically this query makes sure that we retrieve all data from our table. Next, we inside this while loop, we make sure that we retrieve the proper data from these 3 columns in the table into these properties, namely data ID, data timestamp, and data value. So that's happening here in these 3 lines. So we retrieve the data ID from the database, we retrieve the data timestamp, and then finally the data value. And then we just return the entire list of data that are retrieved from the database. So basically that's the sensor data.cs class. I just remove those, you don't need those. So that basically you need also to include this using Microsoft.data.sql client in order to use the methods for communicating and retrieving data from the database. So then we are back in our form 1 and in the designer. I just double click here in order to create the code for retrieving the data from the database. So let's just start by creating a method for creating the chart, and this is known from previous example. We just create a X label, Y label, and a title, and then we use this Add.Scatter and refresh in order to plot the data X and the data Y. And now we need to retrieve that data, X data and the Y data, from this sensor data class. So then I just create a new method. I can call it void get data, like this. And this method should be called when we open the application. So then I put it here in the form load, like this. And inside this method, we are going to retrieve the data from the database. So now here in this get data function we have created, we are able to retrieve data from this get sensor data method that we have created in the sensor data class. So here we have the method get sensor data, and this method actually retrieves the necessary data from the database. and then here in our form 1.cs, this data from this method are put into this variable sensor data list. So this is a list, C# list, basically, in order to plot the data using this ScottPlot library. We need to have to convert the data to two different arrays, one array for the X data and one array for the Y data. So basically I've just made some basic code in order to convert from this data type, which is this list of data from the database created here in this method. And then this code makes sure that we are able to convert from that data to two arrays, namely one array for the X data and one array for the Y data. And the X data is just this data ID from the database, which you see here, basically this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So this will be the X values, and then this data value will be the Y values, which you have here. So now we have actually been able to retrieve the data from the database, and now the next step is just to actually plot this data. So then here we just, when we have converted the necessary data here, we just call this create chart method that we have created already here. Like this. So basically that should be it. Of course, this one needs this argument. It needs to have this data X as an input argument and data Y as an argument. So basically, let's just run this application now and see what's happening. Yeah, there you see. So actually this is the data that are retrieved from the database, and then we use this. So here we retrieve the data from the database, here, and here we convert the data from the database into two arrays, data X and data Y. And then we call the create chart method, which is basically just retrieving this data X and data Y, and then create an X label, Y label, and title, and then actually plots the values using this Add.Scatter method. So basically now we have been able to actually plot data that are stored in the database and then actually present the data inside this ScottPlot chart. Finally, we can just also put the data in this data grid view. So in order to put the data from the database into a data grid view, we only need one line of code. So then we just start by using data grid view 1, which is this one, which has the name data grid view 1. And then in order to, so basically just type dot and then find the data source method, and then equals to sensor data list. So the sensor data list is the values we get from this get sensor data, which is here in the sensor data class. So the return value here is this sensor data list. So basically that's all we need in order to fill data into the data grid view as well. So then let's just run the application. Yeah, and now you see we are getting the data into the ScottPlot chart, and then we also get the same data into this grid view. So then you see the data ID number 1, which is this one. You see you get the data 20. This is the timestamp. For second value here, 2, this is the timestamp, and this is the actual value. So now we are able to present data from the database both in a chart using this ScottPlot library, and then also here in this data grid view. Finally, we can also improve the appearance of this data grid view. So then I just create a separate method called create grid view, where I just specify the name of the headers. So in that way, we can use other names than the actual data columns from the database. You can also specify width of the different columns. So then I just use this method here instead. Create grid view, like this. And the input to this function should be this sensor data list, which we have here. So let's just run it now. So this is our final application. And then you see we are retrieving data, and then we can specify other names here. We can also include units like this, because all values in the graphical user interface should show the unit. So now we know that these values are in degrees Celsius. Also here we know that these values inside the chart are in degrees Celsius. We can also adjust the different columns here, so it fills the entire data grid view. So we can just make them a little bit bigger, 260, 200 or something. So now I have adjusted the width for the different columns, so it fills the entire data grid view like this. So basically, now we have created a basic application that are retrieving data from the database, both in a plot or a chart and in a data grid view like this. There is one final thing we may want to improve. So here we have now on the x-axis we have 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Assuming we have data for that goes through many days or many weeks, many years. Typically, we may also want to have the actual date time here on the x-axis instead of the just running numbers like 1, 2, 3, etc. So let's see how we can do that. Since we're already retrieving from the database, we know we have used the data ID as the x-axis, and we have used data value as the y-axis. But why not use the timestamp that we have from the database here? Use that on the x-axis instead. So then we just go to the form 1.cs. Then instead of the data ID, we want to use .data timestamp instead. And since in the ScottPlot the x and the y-axis needs to be an array of double, we need to convert this to this timestamp to a double using this to OA date. So actually this is a function that is part of C# that are converting a date format to a double value. So that's the one change update we need to do. Just one line of code we need to change. In addition, we need to specify here forms plot 1 plot x axis dot, and we need to specify that we are using actually a datetime format, and then just set this to true like this. So that's all we need to do. We needed to change this one to actually using the timestamp column from the database instead. instead of this date ID. And then we need to convert it to a double using this toADate method, which is part of C#. And then we just need to set that the x-axis should be of a date time format. Let's just run it now. So as you see, so this is our final application. We are able to plot the data, and on the x-axis we have date time, and then we have the temperature in degrees Celsius on the y-axis, and we are also showing the data here in a grid view. So that's all for now. So good luck with plotting your data in your Windows Forms applications. Thank you and goodbye.